U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has picked Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate for the presidential election. Will Harris's bet on Walz be a game changer in her fight against Donald Trump? For more, we're joined by Professor Hans Schattle. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Dami. Nice to see you.
Thanks for joining us. Harris's pick was Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Now, before we dive into details of this new figure, tell us how crucial is choosing a running mate in the U.S. presidential election?
It's debatable, Dami. Ideally, a running mate for the vice presidency helps compensate for a candidate's liabilities, whether it's a presidential candidate's weakness in a particular part of the country, a particular region, or maybe vulnerability on an issue or an area of expertise. Just a few examples through history quickly. John F. Kennedy chose Lyndon Johnson from Texas, who brought in much of the South, and of course his home state compared to JFK's Massachusetts. And Barack Obama brought in Joe Biden as a running mate. Biden brought a wealth of foreign policy experience and knew Washington like the back of his hand in 2008, whereas Obama was still comparatively young and inexperienced. And Donald Trump in 2016 picked Mike Pence, the Indiana governor, to be his running mate because Pence could bring in evangelical Christian voters, something that Trump was not exactly fit to do in that election. But lackluster running mates sometimes win elections. The first President Bush won with U.S. Senator Dan Quayle, who did little to help the ticket. On the other hand, sometimes candidates that are brought in with the goal of just doing no harm or not overshadowing the top candidate don't work out. Hillary Clinton in 2016, she picked Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, and that didn't work out so well. He turned out to be lackluster and didn't exactly help her. So the question is, what does Tim Walz bring to the ticket with Kamala Harris?
Well, it sounds like a right amount of compatibility plays a crucial role in picking the running mate. Then why do you think Harris eventually chose Walz over Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro? Eventually, she narrowed down to the two figures.
Right. Several factors here. One, people call him a Midwestern dad. Kamala Harris comes across as the fun aunt in this presidential year. Tim Walz might have a different character to play, maybe still quite memeable. He also has been brought forward very much so in social media over the past couple of weeks. He's been taking to calling Donald Trump and J.D. Vance on the Republican side just plain weird. And before Walz started that kind of messaging, the messaging we were seeing from Democrats was more about Trump and Walz Trump and J.D. Vance rather, as hazardous, as antithetical to democracy, as too dangerous to put in the White House. Whereas Walz is actually good at bringing a little bit of humor to it. There are several other factors that are interesting as well. Walz comes across on TV in some respects as more of your conventional white male politician, maybe a little bit like Joe Biden was, except he's 22 years younger than Biden. He's the same age as Harris, but he comes across a little bit older than Harris. And then when you get to know him on the issues, he's quite progressive. He will energize, I think, liberal voters and not turn them off. And then the question is Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor. That was the other candidate here who kind of made the final cut in terms of Harris's consideration. Unlike Josh Shapiro, Walz is a little bit more of a blue-collar background. He worked as a high school social studies teacher. He coached football in Minnesota before getting into politics. He has a military background with the U.S. Army National Guard. So there are interesting things that he brings in. One more thing, too. He worked as a member of Congress for Minnesota before taking over as Minnesota's governor in 2019. So he knows the legislative side and the executive side. So even though he's not well known to the U.S. beyond his native Minnesota, let alone the rest of the world, I think he's somebody that could catch on and that could be quite popular in this election and hold up quite well in debates against J.D. Vance.
Right, coming from a pretty diverse background. Now, of course, the announcement came ahead of the 5-day, 7-city tour of the battleground states this week. Professor Schattle, what is it that Harris has to focus from now on?
Well, going forward, both Harris and Walz are going to have to get themselves through the Democratic National Convention, formulate the key positions for the party. They've got probably television debates coming up. They haven't, the details of those have not yet been finalized, but I think it's, a given that we will see debates both for the presidency and the vice presidency. Lots of traveling around the country, too, to try to energize voters. And with that in mind, the first meet and greet they had today was in Pennsylvania, which is very interesting because the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, was, again, as I said, the other top candidate here for the vice presidency. And that's an interesting issue right there. How will Pennsylvania go forward? Will they still turn out for Kamala Harris? Harris may have gambled a bit by not choosing Shapiro because Shapiro is extremely popular in Pennsylvania. He might have made the delivery of electoral votes from Pennsylvania a very big state a sure thing. Yet on the other hand, Shapiro had some downsides as well. Former Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman, who's now in the U.S. Senate, he was openly critical of Shapiro over the past few days. The two of them clashed over the years. And Shapiro also is Jewish. And although he's been critical of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he's been supportive of the war against Hamas. And I think if we're looking at this decision that Kamala Harris made, I think she did not want the war in Gaza to loom large or become inflated in the presidential elections. So there were some factors, I think, in that regard that also tilted her toward Walz. And who knows how they'll work out. If it doesn't work out, there'll be a lot of second guessing, I think, later as to whether Shapiro would have been a stronger candidate. But Walz and Harris seem to have jumped in with both feet, and we'll see how things go.
Yeah. And another big event this week was a U.S. stock market tumbling on Monday over fears that the American economy could be sliding into a recession. And of course, Trump really used this collapse as an opportunity to attack Harris, didn't he?
Well, of course. I mean, anytime there's bad news in the economy, the challenger for the presidency, in this case Trump, will attack those in office. But there are some interesting factors here. I mean, one, the stock market in the U.S. has been very overheated all year. The excitement over artificial intelligence-related companies has been somewhat overdone, and I think maybe reality is beginning to catch up to that. The other factor, a little bit more structural with the economy, the pandemic supply chain disruption that we saw over the last few years, and also the labor market shortages that kind of emerged from the pandemic. This is all still unwinding, but we may be getting back to something closer to normal in the economy. It's also interesting that the latest run-up in the stock market, the rally that just got snapped over the last couple of weeks, that rally coincided in its later stages, especially with the period in which Donald Trump was seen as much more likely to win the presidential election. This was after President Joe Biden's very weak debate performance in June and all the uncertainty that followed that. Once Biden made it clear he wouldn't run for re-election, once he did that about face, and he was out, and then Kamala Harris emerged, and she became quite strong as a candidate right away, a lot of relief in the U.S. that now there was an alternative, not just to Trump, but both Biden and Trump, with Harris maybe now poised as quite a bit more likely to win. I think that is also having an effect on the stock market. Some of that rally was pricing in the prospect of a Trump victory in 2024, and that victory is much less certain now for Trump than it was a few weeks ago.
All right, Professor Schattle, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Rhode Island this morning. You enjoy your evening there.
Thank you for having me, Dami. Hope you enjoy your day. Take care.